If you have your Bible, go ahead and open up to Esther chapter 8. Esther chapter 8. And I lied last week, and I don't like to lie when I'm teaching. I said I was going to review for just 5 minutes, and I think I went for like 12 or something like that. So I'm not going to review at all tonight. So if you're new with us, you're going to have to catch up. Hopefully you know the story of Esther. You've probably read it. You've heard it. You might have seen a VeggieTales movie about it. Sometimes those are a little misleading. So I'd encourage you to go back, listen to these messages online. You can catch up. But I want to get you thinking a little bit tonight. I want to get you thinking. I've been reflecting back over this story the last couple of weeks, especially in light of what happens in chapter 8. And I've titled this message, The Story Isn't Over. We're coming to the last few chapters. There's 10 chapters in the book of Esther, chapter 8, 9, and 10. Next week, we'll cover chapter 9 and 10 together. Chapter 10 is very short, and we'll finish the book next week. But the story isn't over. We finished chapter 7, and we kind of got a little bit of an answer, a little bit of conclusion to what's been taking place. But still hanging out over the people of God, the people of Israel, who are living in the kingdom of Persia and all the provinces that Persia rules over. There's a man named King Xerxes. He had a guy named Haman who sent out an edict that all the Jews would be annihilated on a specific date. And so we've seen Esther and her uncle Mordecai. They've been saved. Haman, their enemy's been defeated. And we got all of that. But there's still this edict that's out to all the people that's calling for the complete destruction, the complete annihilation of the Jewish people. And so the story isn't over. It's not over yet. And we're going to see that here in chapter 8. But I want to get you thinking, because I want you to answer a question with me. And I don't know that there's a solid, firm answer to this question, but I at least want you to think about it. We already discussed earlier in the book, we discussed that it probably wasn't morally right for Esther to conceal her identity as a Jew. You remember that? We looked at how Mordecai encouraged her once she had entered into the king's palace and become the queen, not to reveal, and even before she became the queen, not to reveal that she was actually a Jew, that she was actually one of God's people. And so she didn't. She kept it concealed. And we talked about what that meant, right? It's one thing to not tell people you're a Jew, or not tell people that you're, even in today's world, to not tell someone you're a Christian. It's not like everywhere you go, you have to say, I'm a Christian, declaring it all the time. It's not a sin to not always be telling people that you're a Christian. But it's another thing to completely conceal your identity, and especially in this place. She lived in the kingdom of Persia. She was now taken in to the king's court. And so many of the things that she would have to do, not only would she be concealing her identity, but in order to conceal her identity, she would have to actually go against the word of God, the law of God. She would have had to eat like the pagans ate. She would have had to partake in the things that the Persians partook in. She couldn't show that she was abstaining from those things because she was concealing her identity. And so in doing so, she would have broken the law of God. And so we looked at that and how it probably wasn't morally right. And we compared the story of Esther to the story of Daniel, and how Daniel took a stand for the law of God and the commands of God, and he didn't eat of the things of this worldly kingdom. And so Esther, she doesn't do that. At least there's no evidence of that. And so we talked about that, but that's not the question I want to ask tonight. I want to ask the question, was it pragmatically right for Esther to conceal her identity? Was it pragmatically right? Meaning, was it actually helpful? Did it actually accomplish what she was setting out to accomplish? I want to ask the question, what if Esther had revealed her Jewish identity from the very beginning? I want you to think about that for a second. If we went back, we're not going to do it, but if we went back all the way to chapter 2, when Esther's taken into the king's court, he takes in all the beautiful young virgins, and what if from the very beginning Esther had revealed that she was a Jew? What if she had revealed that she was related to Mordecai, who was a known Jew? What if she had revealed all of this to those in the king's court, and even to the king himself? Well, there's no way to know for sure, right, what would have happened or how the story would have played out. But I think that had she been honest from the start about her identity, I think there's at least some reason to believe that this whole threat, this whole thing that took place, actually might have been avoided. I think it might have been avoided. Had she really revealed who she was, and that may sound far-fetched to you, but just stay with me for a minute. Remember the connection in chapter 2 and chapter 3? What happened at the end of chapter 2? Does anybody remember? Who saved the king's life? Mordecai. He saves the king's life. This story is recorded in what's called the Book of Records or the Book of Chronicles, this book where they record everything that takes place that's of significance. And so the end of chapter 2, you get the story of Mordecai thwarting this plot to assassinate King Xerxes, and it's recorded in this Book of Records. And nothing happens to Mordecai. No reward, no honor, nothing. It's not even hardly acknowledged. It's just written in the book. And then the very next verse, the first verse, we end with that. And it says, after this happened, or after these things, it says the king promoted who? Haman. You would think, in the order of events, you would think naturally that it wouldn't be Haman that the king promoted, but it would be Mordecai, because he just saved the king's life. But it's not. Haman is promoted. And it's an interesting just jump all of a sudden from chapter 2 to chapter 3. Haman is promoted to second in command in all of the kingdom. And so my thought process here is this. What if Esther, she's already the queen at this point, and she's the one who actually goes and tells King Xerxes of this plot that Mordecai informs her of. What if at that point in time, Xerxes actually knew Mordecai was Queen Esther's relative, her adoptive father, her uncle by birth, but her adopted father who brought her in after her parents were killed? What if King Xerxes knew that? Well, I think you could at least say that maybe Mordecai would have been honored. Maybe he would have even been promoted to the place that Haman was promoted. At the very least, if King Xerxes went ahead and promoted Haman, at least Xerxes might have not allowed the edict to go out to kill all the Jewish people, when that meant that this queen and this man who was her adoptive father who had saved his own life would actually be annihilated with them. And so it's a really interesting thought. I don't know that it's something we can answer one way or another. In fact, I know we can't answer it for sure, because that's not how the story plays out. But I think there is something here to draw out from this as I thought about this. Because think about it. What led Esther to conceal her identity? What led her to? She was afraid. She was fearful for her life. The Jewish people were foreigners living in a foreign land that wasn't always so kind to them. And so in order to promote within the kingdom, in order to get ahead in life, in order to protect herself, she had this fear. And Mordecai as well. He even advised her to conceal her identity. And I think the thing to draw out here is this. Very often, we are led into sin because we're afraid of dangers that will never actually materialize, that will never actually happen. Think about it for a minute. Oftentimes, we're led into doing the wrong thing. We're led into sinning, to engaging in some kind of sin, because as we look out at life and we think, oh, if I do this, then maybe I can avoid that. Or if I do this, maybe I can get that. And so we're led into sin often in our lives because we're afraid or fearful of dangers that will never happen. Maybe it's a danger of not getting something that we want. Maybe it's a fear of something's going to happen that we don't want to happen. But that's exactly what happened, I think, to Esther in this story. In this story, she is led into this sin because she's afraid of something that it may never happen, or it might happen anyway. And that's exactly what took place in the story. And think about it for a minute. How often have we failed? How often have we failed to open our mouths and share Jesus because we're afraid of what others might think? We're afraid of what consequence might come at work. Maybe we won't get that promotion if we're known as the vocal Christian. How often do we allow potential dangers and difficulties to paralyze us with fear, worry, anxiety? How often are we led into sin by those worries? Sin often convinces us that life will be smoother. And instead of keeping its promise, it actually leads us into greater difficulties than the ones we feared in the first place. Not only is sin morally wrong, often the path of sin is a lot harder, a lot more difficult than the path of obedience. I think there's a case to be made that Esther, had she been faithful and honest and identified herself with God's people from the beginning, from the start, they may never found themselves in this situation at all. And so I say all of this, church family, to say, don't do what's right because of the foreseen results or the foreseeable results. Don't just do what's right because of the foreseeable results. Yes, they play a factor. The results of our decisions and actions should come into play when we're deciding. Of course, that's part of why God gives consequences for actions. But don't let that solely be the determiner of your decisions and your actions. The question should be this: what is right? What is right? What is going to glorify God the most? Do that and leave the results up to the Lord. That's how we should live our lives. Never should it be, I'm afraid of what's going to happen, so therefore I'm not going to do what's right. Or I'm fearful of what I'm not going to get if I don't engage in this activity, and so I'm going to do that so I can get this. No, do what's right. Do what glorifies God and let the results be up to the Lord. My kids have just recently matured to the age, they're by no means mature, but they've matured to the age where they understand a little bit of what it means that I went to jail for stealing a speed limit sign. Hopefully most of you have heard that story in your life from me, but I, in college, stole a speed limit sign and I spent the night in jail. Okay, long story, I'm not going to go into it. But my kids are finally to the age where my two older ones, Kai and Hadley, where they understand a little bit of what that means. And they think it's absolutely hilarious. I don't think it's that funny, but they think it's hilarious. In fact, Kai the other day was in his class at Joyful Noise telling all of his classmates how his dad is Santa Claus and his dad went to jail for stealing a sign. And so he's got them all confused. I'm hoping there's not a lot of church prospects in there that don't know me, but you know the story. If you know the story, you know that was a great teaching moment as a young 18-year-old kid / almost man, whatever I was at 18. It was a great teaching moment, a life lesson for me. And I remember sitting down with Hadley when I first told her this story, or where she first heard about this story. And I remember walking through. If you know the story at all, I stole the sign, and then I got pulled over by an officer, and I lied to the officer about where I had gotten this sign at. And I remember Hadley saying, "Oh, Dad, you shouldn't have lied because that's why he ended up arresting you, because you didn't tell him the truth." And I said, "Well, that may be true. That may be true, but I shouldn't have lied, not because of the consequence or the result. I shouldn't have lied because it wasn't honoring to God. It wasn't glorifying to God." And you guys, if you've had children or if you've worked with children, you know, one of the things that you try to teach them is you don't do what's right just because you don't want to get in trouble, right? That shouldn't be the heart attitude behind why you do what's right. And so with my kids all the time, we talk about this. I say, "Hadley, are you upset that you got in, that you did this, that you lied, or that you hit your brother?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I got in trouble," right? She's upset not because she did what's wrong. She's upset because she got in trouble. And so often we're that way. We don't really so much care about doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing. We care about the result. And that's where I think Esther was in this story. We should do what's right because it honors God. We should not do what's wrong because it dishonors God. I lied in that situation as an 18-year-old young man because I thought that lie would get me out of trouble. In reality, it actually only made the situation worse. But the results really don't matter. As a Christian, we should do what honors and pleases God. So I just think about that because I think it's a lesson that we've got to learn in the Christian life. But let's jump into Esther chapter 8, verse 1 and 2. We're going to look at this. We'll walk our way through this chapter together. On that day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman. Haman's been hung. He's been hung on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. His plan has backfired. His worst day has come. Now his whole household is given to Queen Esther. And Mordecai comes before the king, for Esther had told had told what he was to her. So verse 1, we find out Esther's completely come clean. She's told the king that she is a Jew, and now she has told the king that Mordecai is her adoptive father. She tells the king what Mordecai was to her. Verse 2, and the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Mordecai, he's honored in this moment. Esther reveals more about her identity. She discloses her connection to Mordecai, and the king now promotes Mordecai to the new second in command. It's come full circle. He has actually taken Haman's position. He was now in the place of Haman, in the highest position next to the king. Things had radically changed, and it's amazing to think about where we've come in this story. All of these things have happened over several years. This has been a long story that's been taking place, and we've seen over and over again in the story that God's timing is perfect. It's perfect. In the midst of the story, it hasn't made sense. But as you step outside the story, you see that God's timing is absolutely perfect. And this story reminds us once again that God is sovereign over all things. He's in charge of everything, even our mistakes. So even though I would say it was a mistake for Esther to conceal her identity back in chapter 1 and chapter 2, and it was a mistake for Mordecai to tell her to do that, it wasn't morally right, even in their mistakes, God is sovereign. He's in charge of all things. He's working all things for His glory and for His people's good. In the words of the great baseball player Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. Over and over again in the story, we've thought, oh, this is the end. Or we've thought, oh, this is going to be resolved. And yet we've been given another cliffhanger after cliffhanger after cliffhanger. How many of you guys have been watching a movie and you kind of come to this intense moment like maybe an Indiana Jones film and you think everything that's bad is behind them, right? And they're sailing off on, just calm waters in the boat and all of a sudden there's a massive waterfall approaching, right? You get past one thing and all of a sudden you think you're in the clear and then something else rolls in. That's how the story of Esther has been. It's been more drama after more drama. And that's what we have here. Mordecai's honored. Esther's honored. Haman's been done away with. It's been dealt with. We think, oh, everything's okay. But wait. There's still that edict. There's still that edict that went out into all the land when Haman was in charge that said to kill and annihilate and destroy all the Jews. So yeah, it's not over yet. It's not over yet. The Jews are still in danger. The city is still in turmoil. And Esther and Mordecai, they're not through yet. Look on in verse 3. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. Verse 6. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? This time, Esther comes before the king, and she's not as dignified as before. Remember, she had taken King Xerxes through a series of feasts, 3 feasts with Haman. There are no feasts in this chapter. No whining, no dining, just pleading. Esther falls before the king. She falls at his feet and she begins to beg for mercy. And again, he has to hold out the scepter, which thankfully he does. And in verse 5, she rises to her feet in his presence and she begins to plead her case. She begins to cry out on behalf of her people. And I want to show you something. I want you to see something quite remarkable about Esther here. There is such a contrast between the heart of Esther and the heart of King Xerxes. In King Xerxes' mind, Esther and Mordecai, they're good to go. He's just promoted Mordecai to Haman's old position. Esther is the queen. They're safe. They live now inside the protection and the palace of the king himself. They're good to go. They're not going to be destroyed, so everything's okay, right? In King Xerxes' mind, everything's settled, right? Well, yeah, in the view of the king of Persia. But this worldly kingdom that he lives in and that he has built and the kingdom of God are quite different. They're quite different. So here's what Esther does. She comes out of the closet. She reveals who she is. Haman wants to kill all of God's people. She raises her hand and says, where's the list? Where's the list of God's people who are to be killed? And with this statement, she basically takes the pen in her hand, walks up, writes her name on the list, and adds it to the death sentence. She's finally identified herself with God's people. Now, this is where it kind of comes into application in our day. This is where we get some application here and now. Have you done that? Esther, in this moment, she goes before the king. She identifies herself with the people of God. Have you done that? Are you identified with the people of God? Let me tell you, there is a ridiculous kind of teaching and belief in our day that all you need in life is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, we'd all agree, right? You need a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Absolutely. I'm not saying you don't need that. But that is not all you need. Good luck finding that in the Bible. There's nowhere in the Bible. I've read it several times. I don't see it. I can't find it. You do need to have a relationship with Jesus that is personal, but it is not only personal. That would be like a child who gets adopted into a family. They need a relationship with their dad? Yes, absolutely. But if they're adopted into the family, who else do they need a relationship with? Mom, the other children in the family. They're not just a child of the dads now. They are a part of the family. That's what it means to be a part of the family. You don't just have dad and no brothers or sisters. It doesn't work like that. Adoption by the father is adoption into the family. And some are like that today. I don't want to be a part of the family of God. I just want to be right with God, me and him. That's all I need. I just need me and Jesus, and we're good to go. I don't want to be a part of a church. I don't want to be in community. I don't want to be under authority. Just me and Jesus. And the Bible doesn't speak anything of that kind of Christianity. It has God's people and Esther here identifying herself with God's people. An attack on God's people is an attack on you. A criticism of God's people is a criticism of you. And that's what Esther demonstrates here. She says, I'm with them. I'm one of them. She could have kept her personal relationship with God. She could have just walked away from the entire crisis. Nobody knew who she was. But see, that wasn't good enough for Esther. Because not only is her salvation, personal salvation, important, but also the salvation of the people of God. She could have walked away and said, oh, they're going to die. Nobody knows I'm one of them. I'm good with God. I don't have a public relationship with God, so I'm not going to have to suffer. I'm not going to have to be ridiculed. I'm not going to have to be murdered. It's a great privilege, though. It's a great privilege, and Esther understands this, to be counted among God's people. I want to encourage us tonight. Let's not be this kind of Christian who just thinks about themselves. Oh, I'm good. I don't have to worry. I don't need other people. I don't need brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's not be one of those kinds of Christians that are really honestly so popular in our culture today. Don't live that way, but live as Esther does. She's got nothing personal to gain from identifying with God's people. She's not going to get promoted higher in the kingdom. She's already the queen. She's not gonna get richer. She's not gonna be more successful. She doesn't have anything to gain by identifying with God's people, at least physically. There's no reward. There's no benefit for adding her name to this death sentence. She's just counting it a privilege to be numbered among the people of God, part of God's family, associated in a community of those who are called the people of God. And I want to show you a few things. If you're following along on your handout tonight, I want to show you a few things about this action, this noble action of Esther's. Number one, I want you to see that divine sovereignty and human responsibility work together. There's a lot of talk and a lot of debate about these two things, right? Is God totally sovereign? What is man's responsibility in all of life, but specifically within salvation? And I think in Esther we see divine sovereignty and human responsibility work together. Work together. There's kind of two perspectives. One perspective emphasizes the sovereignty of God. God's in charge. God's in control. God works it out. God takes care of it. God's in the details. He's got it all handled. Others will go to the other side. They'll go to other parts of Scripture and say, you need to speak, you need to give, you need to serve, you need to help, you need to care. You've got to do your part. And the truth is, the Bible speaks to both of those things. God, yes, is completely sovereign, but at the same time, man is completely responsible. I love this illustration. I didn't come up with it, but it's this truth, and they're like two pedals to a bike, right? You do your part. God's certainly going to do his part. You give what he's asked you to give. He's going to ask everybody else to give. He'll make up the difference. You show up, that's great. God's already there. He's already at work. He's at work in the story of Esther, but part of his work is through the decisions and the actions of Esther. She's working with God. It's like this pedal on a bike. God on one side, human on the other, and we're working together with God. How that all works and makes sense, I don't know, but you see that here in the story of Esther. God at work, but at the same time, man is responsible for their actions. That's the first thing I see in this action of Esther. Number two, God gives power to his people. God gives power to his people so that they might serve those who are powerless. You go all the way back, for such a time as this. Mordecai tells Esther, you have been placed in this position of power for such a time as this. In this situation, God's people are absolutely powerless. You've got this dictator of a king, most powerful man in the world at this time. This isn't a democracy, it's a dictatorship. The people of God, they don't get to vote. They don't get to vote on who is their king. They don't get to write up laws and appeal laws and petition, and they don't get to do any of that. They're completely powerless living in a foreign land. But Esther has been given a position of power. She's been called for such a time as this to be in the king's palace serving as the queen. She's the one person, think about this. She's the one person in the community of God's people that actually has access to the king. She can speak to the king. As the queen, she uses this power to do what? To indulge herself? Does she do what Haman did and try to exalt herself? No. She uses this power that God has granted and given to her to speak up for those who don't have a voice, to give power to those who are powerless. Some of you in this room, whether you think it or not, God's given you a position of power. Some of you are going to increase in positions of power. Some of you are teachers. Some of you are businessmen. Some of you are homemakers. Some of you are lawyers. I could go on and on. We have people in this church that are all over in positions within our culture and within our world. God has given many of you great positions of influence. And God doesn't put us. He doesn't put us in those positions of power just so we can get rich. He doesn't put us in those positions of power just so we can make life comfortable for ourselves. He doesn't put us in those places so that we can selfishly gain more and more for ourselves. King Xerxes is the prime example of a man with power who always uses it on himself. And we don't need more King Xerxes in this world, do we? Especially not in the church. We do not need more men and women who use their positions only and solely for themselves. This is why as a church, we speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. This is why we speak for those that are not even born. This is why we speak for those who don't have a voice. God puts us in positions of power so we can speak up and we can defend the powerless. Number 3, the third thing I see here is that we're to care for God's people first. We're to care for God's people first. Now, this might not hit you right. This may hit you wrong. You might say, oh, but aren't we to love everybody? Yes, absolutely. So don't hear me saying that we care only for the people of God and we don't care about people outside of the church or those that aren't believers. But I do see in the scripture a call for the church to take care of her own. Yes, we want to love the whole community. Yes, we want to love the whole world for that matter, because they're made in the image and the likeness of God. They're loved by God. That's all true, but you can't do that to the neglect of God's people. It's like a family. Are we a family or not? Yes, we're the family of God. We are the family of God. It's just like a family. I love my neighbors. I love them. But I got to feed my kids first. I'm responsible to do that. I'm responsible to take care of them, to care for them first. I love the neighbors, but I've got to tend to my family first, then my neighbors. It's not either or, it's not both and. It's you take care of God's people first, and then then their family next. And what happens sometimes is in the church, we get so excited about other people and other things that we look over those in our own family, those right in front of us. There could be a single mom or a single dad sitting next to you in church. There could be tonight. And they're in need. And we're called as the family of God to care for our family, God's family first. Galatians 6:10. Does anybody know what it says? What does it say? Yeah. As you have opportunity, do good for all people, but especially those in the household of faith. That's what Esther does. She's the queen of Persia. I think she cares about all the people living in this kingdom, but she is particularly concerned about God's people first. Who's going to protect them? Who's going to serve them? Who's going to represent them? Who's going to fight for them? Do you care about God's people? Are you overlooking them? If you're looking for a place to serve or to meet a need, start by looking amongst us. Now, we've got to be careful with that because we don't want to become so inward focused that we neglect those outside the church that have needs, but we have to take care of our own. As I was reading this text again last night, just sitting on our couch, I was struck with the thought. Look at the difference. Look at the difference between Esther and Xerxes. She isn't satisfied with just saving herself. Salvation for herself was not enough. Wasn't enough. Look at verse 6? She says, "For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" She wasn't satisfied with just her own salvation, with just her family's salvation, Mordecai, her physical family. She was concerned about all of her community, the people of God. And I thought, is this true of me? I immediately my mind went to the words of the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 9. He says, "I'm speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience bears witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh." Paul is so concerned about his his kinsmen, he's speaking about the Jewish people, he's so concerned about them coming to Christ that he says, I wish I could be cut off for their sake. That's how much he's concerned. Think about this for a minute. This is how we tend to be. Well, I'm saved. Now what's next? Well, man, my children are saved. Once that's it, man, we kind of check out, right? We don't think so much, and we don't agonize. We don't have great sorrow about others that have not yet come to Christ. And here I see this difference where Esther, she's not just concerned about herself being protected. She's not just concerned about Mordecai being saved. She's concerned about all of the people of God. How many Christians would say, maybe not with their mouths, but certainly with their lives, oh, as long as I'm saved, as long as my children are saved, as long as my family's saved, that's good enough. I'm not worried about all these other people. I don't know about you, but this was convicting for me as I said, is that true of me? Do I long to see those who Christ died on the cross for come to faith? Do I long so much so that I would be willing to be, like Paul, cut off from Christ so that they could be saved? I see that in Esther's life. I see that in Paul's life. I think we should all strive for that kind of love for those to come to Christ. Look on at verse 7. Verse 7. The king Xerxes said to Queen Esther, to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So look at what's taken place here. Look at this. If this was all the king had said in verse 7, okay, if that's it, if he stopped there, it would have been, they'd have been up a creek without a paddle. If all he would have said is, hey, I've given you the house of Haman, they've hanged Haman because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. If he had stopped there, then the Jews still would have died, right? The edict was out. But in verse 8, the king gives them a little bit of hope. Now, he says here that a king's edict cannot be what? Revoked. So, how's he gonna solve this situation? He sent out an edict that can't be revoked. So he can't send out another edict to revoke that edict. So what does he do? What does he do? Well, in verse 8, he says, what you can do is write up another edict, whatever you want, and that one, just as the first can't be revoked, so too the next one can't be revoked. Look on at verse 9. And the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews, had fallen on them. So, Mordecai calls in all the scribes. He writes another edict. Basically, what does he say? He says, anybody that attacks the Jews, that seeks to kill, destroy, or annihilate the Jews, because of the first edict, the Jews can do what? Defend themselves. They can attack back. They can fight back. They can kill, destroy, and annihilate their enemies. We're going to look next week as we close in chapter 9 and 10. We're going to kind of dive into actually what took place, because we see that basically a war breaks out, a small war. It's not the whole kingdom, but those that hated the Jews went ahead and attacked the Jews because they could, according to the first edict. But the Jews could actually defend themselves and fight back, and the Jews actually did, and they destroyed many, many people. We're going to look at that a little bit, because some have taken this passage and they've said, look, this is another justification of God is just the ruthless, it's a Christian jihad, basically. It's another holy war that the Christians waged on those in the kingdom. But that's not what was taking place, and that's not what took place. It was God's judgment upon the enemies of the people of Israel who had attacked and come after them. And so that edict goes out, and we see this complete reversal. We've talked about this. God is the great reverser of destiny. We see this. At the beginning, the Jews were in mourning, right? The first edict went out, they're in mourning. Now the second edict goes out, what are they doing? They're rejoicing. They're having times of feast, and in fact, the whole feast has begun, Purim, because of this event. And so we see this great reversal take place. Now they're rejoicing in the streets. They're celebrating because news has spread that now there is hope, that they're not going to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. This is where I want us to end tonight. I want you to listen to this verse in Daniel chapter 4, verse 35. It says, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but God does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? This is kind of the type of message we see in Esther. This is it. This is what we see in this chapter, but it's really what we've seen all along. God is God. He's in control. King Xerxes, he thought he was all powerful. Haman thought he had risen to great power and that he would do away with God's people, but no one has power like God. God steps in. He steps in this story, and he rewrites the record. And the results are absolutely amazing. Look at the very end of chapter 8. Look at the very end. I love this. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves what? Jews. For fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, most scholars will say that some of these probably were like Esther, changing their identity because they just feared what the result would be if they didn't. But many would say that actually many probably converted to Judaism in this place because they feared the Jews and they feared the God of the Jews. God was using this story, I believe, to make much of himself, to bring glory to himself, to reveal that King Xerxes or anybody in this world is not in ultimate power, but God is in control. God is in fact sovereign, and he is in control. That's what that passage in Daniel says. So we're going to close the study in this book next week, and we're going to look at some things that we kind of some takeaways from the whole book, but we're going to really look at what happens at the end. The Jews are going to destroy their enemies in chapter 9 and 10. Mordecai's going to be honored, and we'll see his greatness and the honor that King Xerxes puts upon him. We'll finish the book, and I'm looking forward to kind of just getting some takeaways from this book. And I'd love to hear from each and every one of you about what God's been teaching you through this story of Esther. I hope, man, if he hasn't been teaching you anything, then I don't know. Either I'm a bad teacher and he's not speaking through me, or you're not listening to the word. But I encourage you, man, I'd love to hear some feedback next week about what God has shown you through the story of Esther.